The Renaissance is often defined as a rebirth of the culture that existed before the medieval ages, based on art, literature, and learning. Humans started innovating things that have had a huge impact on the world, and we can still feel that impact today. This age also showed an introduction to some musical techniques that persist in today's composing. The changes here are not as drastic as the ones noted in my previous video on medieval ages. However, the new ideas at this time still show a large shift in the overall concept of writing music, and they must have taken a lot of thought to come up with. We begin today with Contenance Angloise, which dates back to the 13th century. However, our example will be from the early 15th century. Contenance Angloise is a form of polyphony that focuses on sixths and thirds, instead of the previously more common fourths and fifths. This results in much more complex harmonies that are closer to modern theory, as our current common chords are built on thirds. Let's take a look at Conditor Alme Siderum by Guillaume Dufay. We can certainly see a huge difference between this writing and the writing at the end of last video, as Dufay has a clear chordal writing style that wasn't particularly prevalent in the medieval ages. Almost every chord is formed by a note in the bass, with the two other voices having a third and a sixth. This creates what we currently call first inversion chords, which are any chord with a third in the bass. The harmony here still isn't functional yet, except for the occasional 5-to-1 cadence, some of which are double leading tone cadences that I mentioned at the end of my last video. The only real difference here is that instead of focusing on fourths and fifths, the composers wrote in thirds and sixths. Moving on to later in the 15th century, we have composers like Ockeghem writing entire masses in polyphony, which was almost unheard of in the medieval period. In the medieval ages, composers were pouring their efforts into writing individual movements of the proper mass, which are the sections that were consistent from week to week. It was not common for these composers to write a full mass, it was just way too much work. However, moving into the Renaissance, composers needed to write many full masses in order to stand out. Composers of this time also started to put little secret messages within their masses for other composers to pick up on. One strong writer who emphasizes this is the previously mentioned Ockeghem, who wrote somewhere close to 14 full masses, no small feat. The one we will be looking at here is Missa Mimi, which is a motto mass inspired by one of Ockeghem's prior compositions called Presque Transi. Each movement of this mass begins with a bass line that is very reminiscent of the tenor line in Presque Transi, something that you would only notice if you were also in the composing world at the time. These types of Easter eggs were everywhere in the music of this time. Now, with the context of this piece out of the way, let's take a listen to movement 1 of Missa Mimi, the Kyrie. This piece, although cool sounding, doesn't really have much new going on theory-wise. The only point of interest that hasn't been mentioned before is the use of what we call today modal interchange. The concept of modal interchange is quite simple. It's the idea that in a chord progression, you can take chords from any parallel mode of the home key. I'll show some examples to explain. Here on screen is a basic chord progression in the key of A minor. We can spice it up a little by replacing chords with any chord from any of A minor's parallel modes, but to keep it simple, I'll just take from A major. We can replace this predominant 2 diminished chord with a 4 major chord, taken from the key of A major. Because we are borrowing chords from A major, the progression still makes sense to our ears, it just has a little bit more harmonic interest. Another super common technique is to replace the final tonic chord of a minor phrase with its parallel major chord, almost like a surprising burst of brightness. For another common example, we'll need to switch to a major progression. We can replace this 5-7 with the 4 chord of relative minor for a different sound. This one is super common in folk music. With that explanation out of the way, we can actually take a look at the piece in front of us. At the end of measure 7, we have a 7 diminished that resolves to a tonic chord, but the third is raised, which makes it a major chord. This is the same technique I mentioned above, which was probably written into this movement to add a more positive resolution to the otherwise very melancholic vibe. As for the rules of writing anything history related, it's time to talk about the printing press, and with it, the rise of the madrigal. The madrigal, which emerged in the 1530s, is a genre of Renaissance music defined by being polyphonic and through composed. More importantly, they allowed for music to be more accessible to those who aren't musically educated. Madrigals would be published for general sale in books like Madrigali de diversi musici, Libro primo della Serena by Verdolo, full of compositions from himself and other notable composers of the time. These books would then be purchased and could be performed by a group of friends as a form of sophisticated entertainment. To see how this all worked, let's take a look at Madonna tuo bel viso by Verdolo. What makes pieces like this so good for beginners is that nothing here is really complicated to perform. Almost everything is diatonic to C major, minus this F sharp, which is a temporary leading tone to the following G major chord. With a bit of practice, anyone interested in music can learn to sight read pieces like this to perform with their friends. Something new that was introduced around this time was the idea of suspensions. As we currently know them, suspensions are a delay of a resolution. Let's take this 5-to-1 progression in C major, for example. This example on screen follows all of the basic rules of a standard cadence. However, if we make the soprano note fall slightly later than the rest, we can say that there is a 4-to-3 suspension on the 1 chord. With those numbers coming from the fact that within the chord, the 4th scale degree falls to the 3rd. Our modern version of suspension is actually identical to what was used in the Renaissance, making it super easy for us to analyze. Looking at measures 13 and 14, we have one really strong suspension that creates a ton of harmonic interest. The beat before measure 14 has this F sharp diminished chord, which resolves to G major, but the alto voice lingers on C for a moment before eventually falling to B, which is the chord's 3rd. This creates the same 4-to-3 suspension that I mentioned earlier, just in the alto instead of the soprano. The last piece we'll be looking at today is C'est moi d'aimer, written by Clément Jonquin around 1538. This piece is known as a Parisian Chanson, which entails a monophonic writing style that is close to what we hear in choirs today. It features a clear lead voice, which sings the melody, with the rest of the voices being used for harmonic backing. Let's take a listen. If you've studied harmony before, you may have noticed that this piece sounds extremely functional. There are cadences and half cadences everywhere, and a clear sense of tonic, predominant, and dominant function. Here's the transcription so that I can explain what I mean. Firstly, this progression is extremely common in modern pop music. Using Hook Theory's Trends page, I searched for songs with this progression, and the list I found was huge. Take a look for yourself if you're interested. The reason this progression works so well is because of its simplicity. To start, we have a 1 and 5 chord, which firmly plants us in our home key. We then resolve the 5 to a 6 chord, which is called an evaded cadence and keeps the progression from resolving too quickly. After this, we move to a 4, which is the most common predominant chord, which builds tension with the 4th scale degree, but not enough to immediately need to resolve. This brings us to another 5 chord and eventually to a 1 again, creating a classic cadence and resolving all of that built up tension. Alright, and that's all I have for today. Before the video ends, I want to thank you all again for the massive support on my last video. All of the interaction goes to show that my efforts have been worth it, so I will be sure to continue posting content. Once again, I've definitely missed some details, so if you know anything I didn't mention, please leave it in the comments below. I do have one more video planned for this music theory mini-series, but until then I'm going to go back to writing the most egregious mode mixture chords.